In 1945, Britain stood on the edge of victory and ruin at the same time. They had just defeated Nazi Germany. Their flag flew over a quarter of the planet. Their empire stretched from Africa to Asia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. On paper, Britain looked invincible. Behind closed doors, British Treasury officials knew the truth. The empire was already dead. It just did not know it yet. What killed Britain was not World War II. It was not Hitler or the Blitz or military defeat. What killed Britain was a decision made 28 years earlier, in 1917. A decision so catastrophic that it guaranteed everything that came after. A decision that seemed small at the time but changed the course of history forever. That decision was to abandon economic reality in favor of political convenience. And America made that exact same decision in 1971. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand why the next decade is going to look nothing like the last one. You will see the pattern that destroyed the British Empire playing out in real time in America right now. And if you want to understand where this is all heading, hit that subscribe button because we are about to go deep into the one thing they never taught you in school. The real reason empires collapse. Let me take you back to 1914. At the start of World War I, Britain was the unquestioned financial center of the world. The city of London was not just a place, it was the place. When a merchant in Argentina wanted to buy goods from a manufacturer in Japan, they did the transaction in British pounds through London banks. When a government needed to borrow money, they issued bonds in London. When wealthy families around the world wanted to store their wealth safely, they bought British government debt. This system gave Britain something more valuable than military power. It gave them financial power, the power to control the flow of money around the world, the power to set interest rates that affected every economy on earth, the power to print pounds and have other countries accept them as payment because the pound was as good as gold. Actually, the pound was not just as good as gold, the pound was gold. Britain operated on what was called the classical gold standard. Every pound note in circulation was backed by actual physical gold sitting in the vaults of the Bank of England. If you held a pound, you could walk into the bank and exchange it for gold at a fixed rate. No questions asked. This was not just true in Britain, it was true across the developed world. Germany, France, the United States, all the major economies operated on the gold standard. This created a natural discipline on governments. You could not just print unlimited money because you did not have unlimited gold. If you printed too much currency, people would demand gold in exchange and your reserves would drain away. If you ran trade deficits year after year, gold would flow out of your country until you were forced to change course. The gold standard was like a referee in a game. It enforced the rules. It prevented governments from cheating. It made sure countries could not live beyond their means forever. Then the Great War began, and Britain faced an impossible choice. Fighting World War I required staggering amounts of money. Millions of soldiers needed to be paid, fed, clothed, and armed. Ships, planes, tanks, and ammunition had to be manufactured on a scale never before seen in history. Britain was not just funding its own war effort, it was funding its allies too, lending money to France, Russia, and dozens of smaller nations. The cost was astronomical, more than the entire British economy could produce. The only way to pay for it was to borrow and print money. Lots of money. But there was a problem. If Britain stayed on the gold standard, there was a limit to how much they could borrow and print. The referee was watching. If Britain created too much currency, people would panic and demand gold, and the Bank of England's reserves would disappear. So in 1917, Britain made the fatal choice. They quietly suspended the gold standard. They did not make a big announcement. They did not explain to the public what this meant. They just stopped converting pounds to gold and kept printing money to fund the war. At the time, it seemed like the only option, the patriotic thing to do. Britain needed money to defeat Germany. The gold standard was getting in the way, so they got rid of the referee. What British leaders did not realize, or maybe did not care about, was that they had just broken a promise that had stood for over 200 years, the promise that the pound was a store of value, that it was backed by something real, that the government could not just create money out of thin air whenever it felt like it. Once that promise was broken, everything changed. Here is what happened next. Between 1914 and 1920, Britain printed so much money that prices more than doubled. A loaf of bread that cost 10 pence before the war cost 25 pence after. Wages did not keep up. Savings were destroyed. People who had carefully put aside money for retirement discovered their nest egg would not even cover a year of expenses. But the real damage was not the inflation itself. The real damage was the precedent. Britain had discovered that it could pay for things by printing money instead of raising taxes or cutting spending. It was intoxicating, it was easy, and it was addictive. After the war ended, British politicians faced another choice. They could accept the new reality, admit that Britain had spent itself into weakness, acknowledge that the empire was now a debtor nation that owed massive sums to American banks, live within their means and rebuild slowly, or they could try to go back to the way things were before, try to restore British prestige, try to make the pound as good as gold again, even though Britain itself was no longer as wealthy as it had been. In 1925, Britain chose pride over reality. The government returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. They wanted £1 to buy the same amount of gold in 1925 as it had in 1914. On the surface, this looked like strength. Like Britain was saying, we are still the financial center of the world. The pound is still the reserve currency. Nothing has changed, but everything had changed. Britain was no longer the creditor to the world. It was a debtor. British industry was no longer the most efficient. It had been surpassed by American factories. The British economy was no longer strong enough to support a currency at the old value. To maintain the fiction, Britain had to keep interest rates high, painfully high. This made it expensive to borrow money. Businesses could not expand. Factories could not invest in new equipment. Unemployment soared above 10% and stayed there for years. British exports became too expensive for foreign buyers because the pound was overvalued. Meanwhile, American and German competitors with cheaper currencies stole market share. The policy was economic suicide. Everyone knew it. Economists warned about it. Businessmen complained about it. Workers suffered because of it. But the politicians would not admit they had made a mistake. To admit the pound was overvalued would be to admit Britain was not as powerful as it used to be. That was unthinkable. So the suffering continued for 6 years. Then came the Great Depression. In 1931, as the global economy collapsed, speculators looked at Britain and saw the obvious truth. The pound was overvalued. The economy was weak. The government was running out of gold reserves. So they attacked. Speculators borrowed pounds, sold them for gold or other currencies, and waited for the inevitable devaluation. When it came, they would buy back pounds at the lower price and pocket the difference. Britain tried to defend the pound. The Bank of England raised interest rates even higher, trying to make people want to hold pounds instead of selling them. It did not work. Gold was flowing out of Britain faster than water through a broken dam. Finally, on September 20th, 1931, Britain gave up. The government announced it was leaving the gold standard, again. The pound lost 25% of its value almost overnight. People who had trusted the government's promise that the pound was as good as gold lost a quarter of their wealth in a single day. That moment, that specific day in September 1931, is when Britain stopped being the world's financial superpower. Not officially, not on a map, but in reality, where it mattered. Here is the lesson that nobody wants to hear. Britain did not fall because of bad luck. Britain fell because it refused to accept reality. It kept spending money it did not have on a military it could not afford to maintain an empire it no longer had the economic strength to sustain. It chose pride over prudence, reputation over reality, the appearance of power over the substance of solvency, and it paid for that choice with a century of decline. Now let me show you how America is following the exact same script. In 1971, America faced a similar crisis to what Britain faced in 1931. Other countries were looking at the U.S. economy and seeing the obvious truth. America was printing too many dollars. The government was spending too much money on the Vietnam War and domestic programs. The promise that every dollar could be converted to gold at a fixed rate was no longer credible, so they started demanding gold. France was especially aggressive. The French government would accumulate dollars and then send warships to New York to pick up gold from Fort Knox. They were calling America's bluff. President Nixon faced the same choice Britain had faced 40 years earlier. Accept reality, cut spending, live within America's means, and maintain the gold standard, or break the promise. On August 15, 1971, Nixon chose to break the promise. He announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. He called it temporary. It has now been temporary for over 50 years. At the time, many economists thought this would be a disaster, that the dollar would collapse without gold backing it, that America would suffer immediate inflation and economic chaos. That did not happen. At least not right away. Why? Because of something Britain had in the 1920s and America had in the 1970s. Inertia. The world was already using dollars. The infrastructure of global trade was built around dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. Commodities were traded in dollars. Central banks held their reserves in dollars. Even though the dollar was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by something almost as powerful: habit, convenience, the lack of an alternative. So America got away with it. The dollar remained the global reserve currency even without gold backing. And American politicians learned the same lesson British politicians learned in 1917. You can print money to pay for things and get away with it. For a while. The numbers tell the story. In 1971, America's national debt was about $400 billion. Today, it is over $36 trillion. That is not a typo. We have increased our debt by 9,000% in just over 50 years. In 1971, America ran a small trade deficit. We imported slightly more than we exported. Today we run a trade deficit of nearly $1 trillion per year. Every single year, we consume $1 trillion more than we produce. We make up the difference by printing dollars and borrowing from the rest of the world. In 1971, the U.S. manufactured roughly 30% of everything made on Earth. Today, that number is below 16% and falling. We have offshored millions of jobs, closed tens of thousands of factories, and hollowed out entire industries. We told ourselves this was fine because we were moving to a service economy. But you cannot eat services. You cannot power a city with financial derivatives. You cannot defend a country with advertising campaigns. When you offshore your manufacturing base, you offshore your economic independence. Britain learned this lesson in 1940 when German submarines nearly starved the island into surrender because they could no longer produce enough food domestically. America is learning it right now as we realize we are dependent on China for everything from antibiotics to rare earth minerals to the components in our weapon systems. The parallels get worse. Britain maintained a massive global military presence long after it could afford to. At its peak, the British Empire had troops stationed on every inhabited continent, bases in over 50 countries, a navy larger than the next two powers combined. Even after Britain's economy weakened, even after the debts piled up, British politicians refused to scale back. The empire was a source of national pride. Giving up bases meant admitting decline, so the spending continued until the money ran out. America currently has over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. We spend more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. We have troops deployed in active operations in dozens of nations. We are fighting or funding wars on multiple continents simultaneously. Our military budget is over $800 billion per year. That is more than we spend on education, infrastructure, and scientific research combined. And most Americans think this is normal. That is what empire does to your brain. It makes you think massive military spending is just the cost of being a great power. It makes you forget that you are borrowing money from tomorrow to pay for today's dominance. It makes you believe that the rules of economics do not apply to you, until suddenly they do. Here is the key insight. What destroyed Britain was not the size of its debt in any single year. It was the trajectory, the trend line that showed spending consistently exceeding income, borrowing consistently exceeding the ability to repay, consumption consistently exceeding production. For a while, reputation can mask reality. Lenders will keep lending because they have always lent. Trading partners will keep accepting your currency because they have always accepted it. The system will keep working because everyone assumes it will keep working. This is called the Wile E. Coyote moment. You have run off the cliff, but you have not looked down yet. You are still in the air. Gravity has not caught up, but it will. For Britain, gravity caught up in 1931 and then again in 1956. For America, gravity is catching up right now. Let me show you the specific warning signs. In the last 3 years, central banks around the world have sold over $300 billion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds. They are reducing their dollar holdings, not all at once but steadily, consistently, sending a message. China, which once held over $1 trillion in U.S. debt, now holds less than $800 billion and is still selling. Japan has started to diversify its reserves for the first time in decades. Even traditional U.S. allies are quietly hedging their bets. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively building payment systems that bypass the dollar. They are signing agreements to trade in their own currencies. They are accumulating gold reserves at the fastest pace in 50 years. Saudi Arabia, whose decision to price oil exclusively in dollars created the petrodollar system that has propped up American financial dominance for 50 years, is now openly discussing accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales. If the petrodollar system breaks, if oil is no longer priced exclusively in dollars, the demand for dollars will collapse. And when demand collapses, value collapses. None of this is secret. It is happening in plain sight. But most Americans have no idea because the consequences have not hit yet. We are still in the Wile E. Coyote moment, still running on air. Here is what happens when reality catches up. When a reserve currency loses its status, the effects are not gradual. They are sudden, because the transition happens in the mind. One day, the world believes in your currency. Banks hold it, countries trade it, investors trust it. The next day, the world realizes the currency is backed by nothing but debt and the willingness of a government to keep printing more. Once that realization spreads, once the psychology shifts, the collapse accelerates. Everyone rushes to the exits at the same time. For Britain, that rush happened during the Suez Crisis, but Suez was not the cause. It was just the moment when everyone could see what had been true for decades, that Britain could not afford its ambitions, that the empire was dead, that the pound was a relic. America's Suez moment has not happened yet, but the conditions are identical. We are overextended militarily. We are drowning in debt. We are dependent on the kindness of foreign creditors who are growing increasingly unkind. We are one crisis away from the world realizing the emperor has no clothes. That crisis could be a lot of things. It could be a military humiliation where we try to enforce our will and fail. It could be a debt crisis where Congress refuses to raise the debt ceiling and we default. It could be a geopolitical realignment where our allies decide they would rather not choose sides between us and China. It could be an inflation spiral where the Federal Reserve has to choose between collapsing the economy with high interest rates or collapsing the currency by printing more money. Any of these could be the spark. The fuel is already in place. Let me tell you what life looks like after a reserve currency collapses, because this is what happened to Britain and it is coming here. First, imports become crushingly expensive. Everything you buy that is made overseas, which is almost everything, doubles or triples in price. Electronics, cars, clothes, furniture, even food. Because you are paying with a currency the world no longer values. Second, inflation becomes a permanent feature of life. Governments that lose reserve currency status cannot stop printing money because they are addicted to spending more than they earn. But now, when they print, the value drains away immediately. Prices rise constantly. Wages never keep up. Savings evaporate. Third, the standard of living declines, not in a single crash, but in a grinding erosion that lasts decades. Each generation becomes poorer than the last. Jobs disappear, infrastructure crumbles, public services degrade. The optimism of empire is replaced by the resignation of decline. Britain went through this exact process from 1950 to 1980. A generation of British citizens watched their country slide from global superpower to, in the words of one historian, the sick man of Europe. The same will happen here unless something changes. Now here is the really uncomfortable truth. That change is not coming from Washington. The politicians cannot save you because the politicians are the problem. They are trapped in the same delusion that trapped British leaders in the 1920s, the belief that you can maintain empire on credit, that you can borrow your way to greatness. That reputation is a substitute for reality. Every time someone in Congress proposes cutting spending, they are attacked. Every time the Federal Reserve tries to raise interest rates to slow inflation, the president screams at them to stop. Every time an economist warns about the debt, they are dismissed as a pessimist. We have become a nation that does not want to hear the truth. Just like Britain in 1925. Just like every empire in its final phase. So what do you do? How do you prepare for the collapse of a currency that is still, for the moment, the most powerful in the world? First, understand that the lifestyle you are living right now is artificial. It is funded by debt and sustained by a reserve currency status that is temporary. Plan accordingly. Plan. Do not assume your standard of living will stay the same. Do not assume the government will be able to fund Social Security or Medicare at current levels. Do not assume cheap imported goods will always be available. Second, build real skills. Learn to do things that will have value no matter what currency people are using. Trades, repair, healthcare, food production, teaching. Paper credentials will matter less. Practical competence will matter more. Third, get out of debt. This is critical. When a currency collapses, debts do not disappear, but your ability to pay them becomes much harder. If you owe money on depreciating assets like cars or credit cards, pay that off as fast as possible. Fourth, diversify what you own. Do not keep all your wealth in dollars or dollar-denominated assets. That does not mean panic or do anything extreme. It means be aware that the system you have trusted your entire life is showing the same cracks that appeared before every previous collapse. Fifth, pay attention to the signals. When you see foreign countries accelerating their moves away from the dollar, when you see inflation rising despite official claims that everything is fine, when you see the government having to pay higher and higher interest rates to convince people to buy treasury bonds, know that the timeline is shortening. Sixth, build community. When the British pound collapsed, the people who suffered least were those who had strong local networks, neighbors who helped each other, communities that could share resources. The atomized, individualistic lifestyle that characterizes modern America will not survive the transition. Start building those connections now. I am not saying this to scare you. I am saying this because history is screaming at us and nobody is listening. The pattern is perfect. The trajectory is clear. The outcome is predictable. America is following Britain's playbook step by step. The only question is whether we will be like the British citizens who saw it coming and prepared, or like the ones who trusted the government until it was too late. Let me leave you with one final thought. In 1910, if you had told a British citizen that within 50 years the empire would be gone, the pound would be worthless, and Britain would be begging America for loans, they would have called you insane. Britain ruled the world. The sun never set on the empire. The pound was the global currency. The Royal Navy dominated every ocean. The idea of British decline was unthinkable. But decline does not care about what you think is possible. Decline cares about math. And the math was clear even in 1910 for anyone willing to look. Britain was spending more than it earned, borrowing more than it could repay, consuming more than it produced. The empire was a Ponzi scheme that only worked as long as new territories kept being added. Once expansion stopped, the scheme collapsed. America stopped expanding decades ago. We are now in the managed decline phase, the phase where we try to maintain the appearance of dominance while the foundation crumbles. Britain stayed in this phase for about 40 years. America has been in it for about 30. History suggests we do not have much time left. So here is my challenge to you. Stop pretending everything is fine. Stop assuming the future will look like the past. Stop trusting institutions that have proven they will lie to maintain the illusion. Start looking at the data. Start seeing the pattern. Start preparing for a world where America is no longer the global superpower and the dollar is no longer the reserve currency. That world is coming. The only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. Subscribe, because the story is just beginning, and you need to understand what comes next.